Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what I think will be a very engaging and very thought-provoking symposium. We're all here for the Psychology Symposium on Social and Emotional Development and Risk and the Role of Neurobiology. And I must say that even though I'm a mathematician, I find this subject extremely thought-provoking as an educator. And one of the things that I find extremely interesting about these questions is how we as human beings are evolving and living together in harmony or not harmony with the world of social media and the world of electronic devices. And now science is even showing that very, very young people, babies, are seeing certain developmental features, whether they are engaged with these smart devices or not. And some are even suggesting that just as alcohol and cigarettes actually stifle human development at a very, very young age, maybe that's also true with social media. So this has been on my mind for a while. We have three incredible experts here, and I'm really excited about hearing them. Two of them, I'm delighted to report, are actually Southwestern alumna, which is very, very exciting. And one is a world's leading expert in this field. So we're in for a treat to hear all three of them. There'll be opportunities for engagement, and I welcome all of you here. And I'm delighted to introduce to you our host, Dr. Brian Neighbors, who will kick us off. Please give a hand to Dr. Neighbors.
Thank you, President Berger. It's so nice to see all of you here, particularly the esteemed members of our Board of Trustees. I'll be brief because I know you did not come to hear me, but I do want to take just 1 minute to thank all the campus constituents without whom this symposium would not have been possible. So thank you to my colleagues in the Psychology Department, the offices of Alumni Relations, Marketing, and Student Life, the Dean of the Faculty, Paul Sicard and his students, Francie Schroeder, Susie Bullock, and the student leaders of Psy-Chi and Active Minds. A special thank you to Dr. Blair for being here today, and most especially to Laura and Rachel for caring enough about Southwestern to take the initiative to make all this happen. Our speakers are each going to present, and they will each be followed by a brief question period, and then following Dr. Blair, we will have a reception in the lobby. Our first speaker, Rachel Thibodeau, graduated from Southwestern in 2013 and is now already finishing a PhD in developmental science and cognitive psychology at the University of Alabama. Rachel's research interests focus on discovering mechanisms to facilitate emerging cognitive, emotional, and social skills in typically developing and at-risk children. Her dissertation research is exploring how pretend play can serve as a protective factor to minimize deficits in school readiness in an at-risk population. Next fall, Rachel will be joining the faculty in the Human Development and Family Science Department at the University of Missouri as an assistant professor. Please join me in welcoming back Rachel Thibodeau.
Hi there, can everybody hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And what many of you may not know is that my journey at Southwestern actually began back in 1994 when I attended a summer music camp here as a 4-year-old. So as fate would have it, a few years later, my sister started her freshman year here in 1999. And as a 3rd grader at the time, it was a pretty traumatic experience dropping my sister off at college. So I resented Southwestern a little bit at that time in my life. But I did not know that 10 years later, I would be living in the same dorm, sitting in the same classrooms, getting fist bumps from the same dining hall staff. Y'all know who I'm talking about? And even doing capstone with the same professor as my sister. So I'm so grateful to be back at such a wonderful institution that has given so much to me and my family, and so honored to have been invited to be a part of this symposium today. So to give everyone an overview of my talk today, I'm first going to start out by explaining what I mean when I talk about this school readiness gap and why it's important, particularly in regards to low-income children's cognitive, social, and emotional development. Then I'm going to go over a few studies I've been conducting with some colleagues at the University of Alabama that look at ways that we can improve at-risk preschoolers' outcomes. The talk show here later in this symposium focused mostly on social and emotional development in youth. So in my talk today, I want to kind of set the stage by discussing how these foundational skills develop at an earlier age. So I'll specifically be focusing on the preschool period and kind of going over and discussing what happens if we don't spend time and resources on developing these foundational skills early on in a child's life. So without further ado, research demonstrates that children from low-income backgrounds are more likely to experience negative environmental contexts than their peers. For example, parents of low-income families often experience high rates of stress and depression due to financial strains or the fact that they're having to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. Now, this stress often leads to high rates of marital instability and poor parent-child relationships. So these stressors are collectively known as risk factors because we're finding that these stressors lead to poor outcomes in terms of children's cognitive, social, and emotional development. Unfortunately, these cognitive, social, and emotional skills are foundational for a child's success in school. And I think that's nicely demonstrated in this graph here. So in this graph, we have children's academic ability as they're entering kindergarten compared across different levels of family income. And what we see is that among children from families with the lowest level of income, they're entering kindergarten substantially behind their peers. So you may look at this graph and say, does this really matter? Should we be concerned about this? Because they're just kindergartners after all, and surely they'll eventually catch up to their peers. Well, unfortunately, it does matter. So studies have shown that children who lack these basic cognitive, social, and emotional skills are not only likely to experience difficulties during the transition to kindergarten, but they're also more likely to experience peer rejection, drop out of school, experience mental health problems, and engage in dangerous and illegal behaviors later in life. So this graph here is a study that followed kids from the time they were 3 years old until they were 40 years of age. And we see that half of these children were enrolled in a program, so the dark red bars here, these children were enrolled in a high-quality preschool program that specifically focused on developing these cognitive, social, and emotional skills. The other half of the children in this program, represented by the light red bars, were not enrolled in an enriching preschool program. And we see that those children who were not adequately prepared for school demonstrate significantly poorer outcomes into their adulthood years than their peers who were adequately prepared for school. So for example, those not prepared for school were less likely to graduate from high school, they made less money in their respective careers, and they were more likely to be on welfare as an adult. So we can see that something as simple as preparing a child for school by really facilitating these foundational cognitive, social, and emotional skills can have lasting impacts across many domains. And there's important economic implications of this as well. So it's estimated that there's a 7-to-1 return on investment for preparing a child for school. So the question then becomes, how do we best prepare children for school? Well, there's many ways we can attack this problem. For example, government initiatives like the No Child Left Behind Act have focused on teaching children foundational knowledge, such as their ABCs and how to count, as a means to prepare them academically for kindergarten. Other programs have focused on educating parents on developmentally appropriate practices. And others have developed breakfast and lunch programs to ensure that children are healthy enough to attend school. Despite these repeated and concerted efforts to improve school readiness, kindergarten teachers are consistently reporting that half or more of the children entering their kindergarten classroom are experiencing moderate to difficult transitions, with these difficulties, not surprisingly, being especially evident and pronounced among children from low-income populations. So where does the problem lie? Well, if you think about the examples that I just mentioned, you'll notice that many of these previous programs really only focus on improving one aspect of a child's development. So if we just focus on helping children say their ABCs and learning how to count, they may never develop the self-regulation skills that are necessary for them to sit still and pay attention and follow directions. Similarly, we can't expect to see changes in development if children spend half of their day in an enriching preschool program only to go home to a chaotic environment that's full of the negative stressors that I mentioned earlier. So there's been a recent emphasis on developing what we call two-generation approaches, where we're trying to affect change at both the child and the parent level. Although high-quality early education and skill development is still emphasized within this two-generation framework, it's not the only emphasis. It's accompanied by emphasis on providing educational opportunities, addressing mental health issues, and creating social support networks for struggling low-income parents. So for the past 4 years, researchers at the University of Alabama have been working to develop and test a 4-generation program called the PowerPath program in order to improve at-risk preschoolers' cognitive, social, and emotional readiness for school. This PowerPath program combines the PAS preschool socio-emotional curriculum with the Coping Power Parent program and focuses mainly on creating consistency between the school and the home environments. So children and parents participate in a series of lessons that focus on building emotional awareness, self-regulation, problem-solving skills, and social support. Now, although children participate in these lessons during the school day in their classroom, and their parents participate in separate parent meetings, the PowerPath program is specifically designed to integrate the concepts that parents and children are learning, so that what a child learns in their classroom can be reinforced in the home as well. So for example, during Unit 3 of the program, we teach children how to respond appropriately to stressful situations in their everyday life. Specifically, we teach them a technique called the turtle technique. So rather than becoming outwardly upset and screaming, crying, and hitting their friend, which is what we typically see among 3 to 5-year-olds in this population, children are taught to get into their turtle shell, to take a deep breath, and calmly explain to their friend how they are feeling and why they're feeling that way. So I have a video here of a child engaging in this technique on the playground. So his friends have told him that he cannot play with them on the playground today. So I want you to see how a child is able to use this technique and what the resulting outcome is.
What's the green something? What can we do now? No, you don't need to say sorry. You already did tell me what to do now. Wow, Lorraine's welcoming.
Oh, wow. Wasn't that nice? I guess
So you're able to see that this child was able to respond to the stressful situation of his friends not wanting to play with him in a behaviorally and emotionally appropriate way. And that ultimately led him to being accepted back into the friend group without any tears or forcing by the teacher. So at the same time children are learning this self-regulation technique, parents are not only taught this skill that their child has learned so they can reinforce that in the home, but they're also taught strategies for how to handle stress in their own lives. And what we're finding is that among children who participate in this PowerPath program, they're demonstrating better cognitive outcomes than their peers who participated in a control group who did not participate in the program. So specifically among the PowerPath children, so those are the kids in the red bars here, we see that they're showing improvements in their working memory, improvements in ability to control their thoughts, as well as decreases in the number of problem behaviors they're demonstrating. In addition, we see that among PowerPath children, they're showing decreases in their level of aggressive and asocial behavior, and they're less likely to be excluded by their peers over time. Whereas children in our control sample either are not making changes over time, or in the case of aggressive behavior, they're actually getting worse over time. Among parents, we see that parents in our PowerPath sample are actually achieving higher rates of education, which is interesting. We also see that family cohesion is remaining relatively stable among PowerPath families, where it's decreasing over time in our control sample. And finally, parental distress is progressing at a slower rate among families who participate in our PowerPath program. So we're currently following these children and their families into kindergarten and first grade in order to determine if this program influences children's well-being and success beyond the preschool years. However, despite the effectiveness of two-generation programs like the PowerPath program, it's important to note a few challenges that exist with these programs that we need to address moving forward. First of all, these programs are very costly. So just to give you an idea, the materials for the PAS program, which is used in the PowerPath program as a whole, cost about $850 per classroom. which isn't exactly feasible for some of these low-income preschools that lack resources to begin with. In addition, teachers have to go through extensive training before they're allowed to implement these programs into their classroom. So the complexity of these programs often places additional burdens on teachers, leading to poor implementation fidelity and thus poor sustainability. So in order to improve upon the sustainability of these programs, it's important that we identify more cost-effective, natural environmental experiences that are implicated in the development of these skills. And so that brings me to pretend play. So as we discussed earlier, children from these low-income backgrounds are more likely to experience negative environmental contexts in their peers. And these stressors, in turn, negatively influence their cognitive, social, and emotional development. On the other hand, pretend play is an enriching childhood activity that provides a positive context to scaffold development. So for example, pretend play is characterized by cooperation, shared affect, support, and skill development. So as these at-risk preschoolers spend more time engaging in this highly enriching pretend play, they're likely experiencing a positive context that may compensate for some of the negative stressors that they experience on a day-to-day basis. And that's exactly what I'm finding in my dissertation work. So specifically, we see that among these low-income, at-risk children, those who engage in high levels of pretend play, who are in the gray bar here, they're demonstrating better skills at regulating their emotions and responding appropriately in stressful situations than their peers who are engaging in mid to low levels of pretend play. When we look at various cognitive skills, we see again that children who have a high propensity towards pretend play are demonstrating better cognitive skills than their peers who have low to mid levels of pretend play. And it's important to note that on this measure of cognitive function, higher scores actually indicate poor performance. And a score of 60 or higher indicates that a child has enough cognitive deficits to warrant evaluation by a clinical professional. So it's really interesting to see that among children who have low levels of pretend play, on average, they're reaching these clinically significant levels of cognitive deficits. So these differences were really interesting to find, but I wanted to take these data one step further and see if pretend play was actually buffering at-risk children from some of the negative outcomes they experience due to the stressors in their everyday environment. So as I mentioned earlier, low-income environments are characterized by numerous stressors that put children at risk for atypical development, including the following. So if we add up all of these stressors, we can determine who is most at risk for atypical development, with those that have all of these stressors present in their lives being the most at risk, and those with none of these stressors present in their lives being the least at risk. So what I'm finding in my data is that among children who are most at risk, so in other words, those that have the most number of stressors present in their lives, among these children, those that engage in high levels of pretend play, represented by the gray bar, demonstrate the best cognitive outcomes, whereas their peers who engage in low levels of pretend play are demonstrating the worst cognitive outcomes. So it's interesting to note that pretend play doesn't really seem to be influencing cognitive performance among children who have low levels of risk present in their life. But this makes sense, right? So these children don't need positive and enriching pretend play to compensate for negative stressors in their life because they're not experiencing high amounts of stress on a day-to-day basis to begin with. Okay, so far all the data I've talked about has to do with children's observable reactions to stressful situations in their everyday life. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what's actually going on physiologically inside of a child's body as they are experiencing these stressful situations. So just like you and I, when a child is in a frightening situation, the sympathetic branch of their autonomic nervous system is activated, preparing their body to respond to the threat that lies ahead. So when you're in a stressful situation, you may notice that your heart begins to race, and your breathing gets heavy, and your palms get sweaty. These are all ways that your body prepares itself to respond to the stressor that lies ahead. So with recent advancements in technology, we're actually able to measure these biological responses that occur largely outside of our conscious control. And in my research, I focus on one of these reactions by measuring the activity of the sweat glands on the hand. So to do so, I attach 2 small electrodes to children's palms and measure their skin's electrodermal activity as they undergo a series of challenging tasks. So for example, the first thing I do is I have them answer a bunch of questions that I asked them without giving them any verbal or facial feedback to mimic what we would consider as adults to be a very stressful social interaction. I then have them repeat long strings of numbers back to me and make it really clear when they're failing by pointing out their mistakes. Next, I have them engage in a taste test where, unbeknownst to them, I drop lemon juice on their tongue, which, as you can imagine, comes as a very shocking surprise to some of these 3 to 5-year-olds. And finally, I have them watch an emotionally arousing clip from Sleeping Beauty where Maleficent the dragon is trying to dramatically kill the prince. So what I'm finding is, again, among children who are most at risk for this atypical development, those who engage in high levels of pretend play are demonstrating the less reactivity in these stressful situations compared to their friends who engage in low levels of pretend play. They're demonstrating the most level of reactivity in these stressful situations. And in these high-risk settings, it's actually adaptive to be less reactive to these stressful situations. So again, pretend play seems to be serving as a protective factor for these children in high-risk settings. So just to summarize everything I've talked today and give you some take-home points to leave with, we first learned about the importance of addressing development across generations and across context. Now, I know this sounds like a fairly intuitive concept, but it's very surprisingly rarely practiced in preschool settings. So with the development of 2-generation programs like the PowerPath program, hopefully we'll continue to see improvements in children's cognitive and social development, especially in these at-risk populations. In addition, we learned that pretend play appears to be an additional cost-effective method to facilitate cognitive and social development among children in these high-risk settings. So by emphasizing the importance of pretend play in preschool and home settings, we can hopefully continue to help close these achievement gaps that we saw earlier, as well as potentially improve children's outcomes into their adolescent and adulthood years. So before I finish, I just need to quickly acknowledge everybody who has contributed to this research, including my advisor, Dr. Ansley Gilpin, and the graduate and undergraduate students in the Kid Lab, as well as all of the participating preschools and funding agencies. And finally, thank you to all of you for your attention today. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Yes?
By asking this question, I will identify myself as the dumbest guy in the room.
No, absolutely not.
Pretend play.
What is pretend play? Sure. So pretend play, there's a wide spectrum of what we consider to be pretend play. So pretend play can be engaging in various imaginative behaviors. So you can be pretending to be a mommy and daddy in the classroom and taking care of a baby. And it can vary to be more imaginative to where you're pretending to be a pirate or pretending to be a superhero, pretending to be an astronaut flying to the moon. So there's different behaviors that you can engage in that we consider pretending. We also gauge level of imagination based on the types of books that children prefer and the types of TV shows that they prefer, with some being more imaginative than others. So we can kind of get at it that way as well. And then in addition, a small portion of the population, about 1/3 of children, have an imaginary friend. So that's another way we can kind of gauge who has the most propensity towards this imagination. Are they engaging in play with an imaginary friend, or more common, do children believe in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy, some of these pretend identities that are common in our culture. So we kind of collect all of those different behaviors and cognitions together to get a comprehensive picture of a child's imagination or propensity towards pretend play. Does that answer your question? Sure, great. Other questions? Yes, I think I saw your hand next.
In the graph that you had on there, why are the children who in lower stress situations have a higher reactivity to stress with higher imaginative play?
So in the last biology slide, I'll just go back to that one really quickly. So children in high-risk settings, why do children who have high pretend play have a lower reactivity? Was that your question?
The other end of the spectrum.
Okay.
Low-risk children have a
Sure.
higher.
Okay, that's a great question. So one thing that we're unsure of at this point, these are just kind of preliminary results. So we don't know if those differences there are actually meaningful differences. So you can see that those lines are closer together than the lines at the high end of the spectrum. Let's assume that they are meaningful differences. So I mentioned that in high-risk settings, it's adaptive to not be reactive to stress, correct? However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, when you're in very supportive environments, it's actually better to be more sensitive to the environment around you. And I have an extra slide because I knew this question would come up, so we will go to that. So I think the easiest way to explain this is to use the analogy of a dandelion and an orchid. A dandelion is a very hardy plant that can survive many different environmental contexts. It can grow in a greenhouse. It can also grow in the cracks of the sidewalk, right? Versus an orchid is a very sensitive and fickle plant. So when it's in a very supportive environment like a greenhouse, it blooms beautifully. But speaking from my own personal experience, if you don't care for it very sensitively, the outcome isn't so pretty. So we kind of think children are very similar. So some children are like dandelions and some children are like orchids. Some children are very sensitive to the environment around them. They're the dandelions. Some children are not, or they're the orchids. Some children are not so sensitive, so they're the dandelions. So as you can see in this graph here, adversity is increasing this way. When you're in really adverse context, if you are not as sensitive to that context around you, you're going to demonstrate better outcomes than if you're extra sensitive to what's going on around you. So if you have an orchid in my apartment where I don't take care of my plants, that outcome's not going to be good. But if I had dandelions in my apartment where I don't take care of plants very often, it's going to develop the same no matter what. So that's how we kind of conceptualize children in high-risk environments. However, at the opposite end of the spectrum, like you were pointing out, when you're in a really supportive environment, it's advantageous to be really sensitive to that environment so you can reap the most benefits from that support around you. So it's better for that orchid to be an orchid in a greenhouse because it's going to be a much more beautiful flower than a dandelion in a greenhouse. Does that kind of make sense? So when you're in high-risk, adverse settings, it's better to be less sensitive to what's going on around you versus if you're in these really supportive environments, you want to be sensitive to all of the support around you so you can reap the most benefits from that. So I think that's kind of what's going on there. I think I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to clarify.
Sure.
Here, the high-risk children with the dandelions?
No, so you can be a dandelion or an orchid in a high-risk setting. So that's just their sensitivity to their environment. It's a good question. This is a tricky concept. You can be a dandelion or an orchid in a high-risk setting. However, depending on the setting you're in, it's either better to be a dandelion or better to be an orchid. So if you're in a high-risk setting, it's better to not be sensitive to your environment like a dandelion versus an orchid. If you're an orchid in a high-risk setting, you're going to take in all of those negative stressors, and that's going to negatively influence your development and your outcomes.
So then, I still may be misunderstanding something here.
Sure.
Then how does it improve children's situation if pretend play is low for physiological?
So pretend play is actually not changing their reactivity to stress. So we think that their reactivity to their environment is largely genetically driven. That's something we're still trying to kind of figure out. But what pretend play is doing is it's providing these children in these adverse situations with a positive context. So they have all these stressors present in their lives, but if they're engaging in this really enriching positive pretend play, that's kind of minimizing the effect of the stressors in their lives. So they're still just as reactive to the stress. So we're talking about dandelions here, so kids who are extra reactive to the stress. What we're doing is we're moving them from this line of adversity, we're trying to move them down this way by providing more positive experiences for them. So we're trying to put them in these supportive, enriching environments by having them engage in this pretend play, so that if you are an orchid, you can move down the line here and kind of develop into a more beautiful flower or see better outcomes. So does that make a little more sense? Okay, hands up everywhere. Dr. Berger.
So when you were showing the graphs of the folks that were in the program and that were not in the program, you showed parental distress.
Mm-hmm.
You said that for the parents that were in the program, it was less steep, which was absolutely true, but it was much higher than, and I wondered why was that?
Yeah, so I think that's just an artifact of our sample at this point. So you can tell they start out at higher levels of stress in our control group. So these schools that participate in the program are randomly assigned. So it could have just been, for whatever reason, the schools within that condition that participated in our Power Path program, we don't know why they reported higher levels of stress, but they started out that way. But it's still interesting to see that although they start out at higher levels of stress, their increase in stress over time is a lot steep than parents in the control group. And these data, you'll see they say results preliminary up there. This is only about half of our sample. So this is around 200, 250 kids amongst 500 total that we're collecting data from. So we might see some of those differences wash out with our full sample. Okay, you've had your hand up back there for quite a while.
Yes. Why did you use a figure of $2,000 a month a while ago?
Say that one more time.
Why did you use the figure of $2,000 a month ago?
$2,000 a month?
Yeah.
For the
What are
program?
the factors? Where to start?
Oh, for the effects of not being prepared for school. This one. So this is data from another study. So I'm just using their data to demonstrate this concept. And what they found is that among children who were not prepared for school, when they followed them into their adulthood years, 7% were making more than $2,000 a month. So that's just the kind of marker that they used in their study versus children who were adequately prepared for school, almost 30% made more than $2,000 a month of total family income. So, yes?
The pretender that you're talking about, is it like within a social context with your peers, or is it by themselves, like their own voice?
That's a good question. So we kind of see varying levels of whether or not children engage in play with their friends or by themselves. That's not something that we've looked at specifically, but it's a direction we're wanting to move going forward to see if engaging in pretend play with a group of friends, is that more beneficial than if you're just kind of pretending on your own? And my hunch from what I know from this literature is that probably when you're engaging in play with your friends, you're going to see more benefits from engaging in that type of play. Versus if you're kind of just always in your own world, imagining by yourself, that could be kind of perceived as being asocial by your friends. So we haven't studied that specifically, but that is a very interesting direction that we're hoping to move going forward. So great question. Okay, I saw your hand going.
I was surprised to see that one of the three risk factors for low income kids that you mentioned was low parental work. So I haven't seen that before, and then I noticed your citations were from like 25 years ago, and so I was wondering, well, which is fine,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to like the current research. Is that what both
So-
applied today?
Yeah, so that's kind of the standard that's used. Even it was established 25 years ago or whatever it was, but it's still used today. So we basically any factor that leads to poor developmental outcomes, you can include that as a risk factor. So one thing we know is that if parents aren't particularly warm with their children, that puts them at risk. We see poor outcomes in their cognitive and social development. So that's why that's included as a risk factor, because we do see negative outcomes based on how warm the parent-child relationship is.
And you were saying that's more prevalent for low income kids.
Yes. Yes, and I think a lot of that is driven by some of these economical reasons. They're just not at home as much to spend time with their kid, and when they are at home, they're stressed out, so they don't have the time or the desire to really sit down and read a book with their kid or engage in play with their kid. So we do see that more often in these low-income populations. So, okay, I think that's it.